Hi, I'm Dr. Chris Stankovich, and welcome to our course, Therapeutic Approaches to Counseling Student Athletes. This is a very interesting time in athletics as far as it goes to applying what we know from the counseling field to helping student athletes with some of the unique issues and transitions that they experience. And so throughout this course, I want to help you better understand the lifestyle of a student athlete today, the unique issues that they face, and some of the traditional issues as well, not just the contemporary issues that are new today, but also the more traditional issues, for example, hazing, that's been around for a long time, and how counselors can intervene and better approach athletes and help them get the help that they need. So I want to begin by just telling you a little bit about my experiences in working with student athletes. I've been a professional counselor and specializing in athletic counseling for over 20 years now, and it's been a very interesting experience, and it actually predates even before that. When I was a kid in the 70s and 80s and played youth sports, I can tell you that things have changed a lot since those days. When I was a kid, we typically had a new sport each season. Summer sports were not nearly as long as they are today. We didn't have travel leagues or premier clubs or things like that. Today, though, youth sports and interscholastic sports, and I'll be using those terms interchangeably, have really advanced. Critics have argued that it's become far too serious. Critics have argued that parents have become overly involved and that kids are facing more stressors today than ever before. And I would say that in my experience, I would acknowledge that those things are true. I have seen just over my own professional career a lot of changes, some for the better and some maybe not so good, but we have definitely seen a number of issues relating to sports burnout, and that will be, again, one of the topics that we come back to time and time again. But I did want to kind of begin by saying that the field has changed as well. I know that counselors are in greater need today to work with student athletes. Counselors are in greater need to work within school systems and youth sport leagues, to help with coaches, administrators, with parents, to help them better understand some of these newer trends that have emerged. And so it's a real changing time today, and I think it's a very important time for counselors who either want to go full speed into athletic counseling or carve out a small percentage of their practice to work with student athletes. Why do we study student athletes is a big question that I often face. And one of the things that I would share with you early on in this program is that more than 50% of students in most of the schools across the country today have kids involved in sports. So when you think about that, more than 50% of a student body is involved in athletics. That right there gives us enough reason to look at them as kind of a subpopulation with unique needs and a unique lifestyle. We also have a lot of research why kids play sports, and survey after survey has shown us that the number one reason why kids play sports is to have fun, and interestingly, the number one reason why they leave playing sports or quit playing sports is when they are no longer having fun. And if we dig deeper with that question, creating a fun, meaningful, safe experience takes work. It takes work not only by parents and coaches, but also you if you're involved in a counseling capacity, and also helping kids avoid not having fun, paying attention to some of the dangers that are out there, whether they're physical dangers or emotional dangers. And so we kind of want to look at it from both ways. We want them to have a really fun, meaningful, safe experience, but at the same time, we don't want them to leave prematurely because they have been victims of some kind of circumstances that could have been avoided. I've already mentioned that it's a unique lifestyle and that they have unique needs, but there's also a nice silver lining to the athletic experience for kids when we do it right, when we create an experience that is meaningful for them. And one of the things that I'll come back to later in the program, but I want to at least introduce it now because I think it's a real valuable piece for counselors from a therapeutic perspective when looking to help student athletes. One of the things we try to do is boost their self-confidence. And ironically, a lot of the kids that we see that are very confident on the field, on the court, in the pool, don't always show that same level of confidence when it comes to academic success or the confidence they need in social relationships. And so many years ago, I kind of serendipitously fell upon the discovery of athletic transferable skills. And that would be the skills that athletes learn while competing in sports that actually can end up being very therapeutic, can be very advantageous to them outside of their sport experiences. And I'm talking about the ability to set and achieve goals, to work with team members, to develop motivation, resiliency, focus, and the list goes on and on. And ironically, a lot of the kids have these skills, but they haven't identified them. And they make some errors in judgment, actually. One, sometimes student athletes, because they use these skills so often, day in, day out, forget or overlook their importance. They find them to be just the kinds of things that you learn while you're playing sports, but not really that valuable. And I think the second mistake that a lot of student athletes make is that they falsely assume that all the other kids in their school system have also learned and mastered these same skills. And I would argue that that's not always the case. I think that the sport experience certainly provides a unique set of skills that can be parlayed not only into academic success and social success, but even future career success. So that's an important note for counselors to take away when we're looking at why we study student athletes and some of the unique nuances and perspectives that we want to think about while working with student athletes. Later in the program, I'll go into some of the unique issues in greater detail, but for now, I want to give you a few more things to think about why in this day and age we find it to be so important that counselors are actually trained to work with student athletes. And I've been talking about some of the unique issues. I want to introduce a couple of them now. One is youth sport burnout, and this is an interesting condition because there's no clinical diagnosis for it. You will not find this in the DSM. It's actually a hybrid of different symptoms that student athletes often face by playing too long, too hard. And later in the program, I'll kind of go into how you can identify it, what the types of burnout look like, and how you can address it as a counselor. We also have seen an increasing number of kids begin to specialize in a sport. And what I mean by that is, unlike in days past where you would have the traditional three-sport letter winner, a kid would play a fall, winter, and spring, summer sport, today we're starting to see increasingly more kids specialize. And what I mean by that is they play one sport and they often play that sport year-round. And so the advantage to that, some would argue, certainly you have a faster skill acquisition, you become more proficient at an earlier age. But conversely, you also face a much greater risk of youth sport burnout for the obvious reasons. Some of the kids that I've counseled in my practice play one sport 10, 11, sometimes 12 months a year. Now, not every kid goes through youth sport burnout that specializes, but certainly a greater number of kids do. And so that's, again, something for you as a counselor working in this field to want to pay attention to. That usually that's at the crux of some of the issues that the kids face off the field when dealing with these stressors. Another issue that is unique for student athletes would be some of their unmet dreams. And, not every kid dreams of playing college or professional sports, but many do. And in fact, in some cases, we have issues where parents want this to occur even more than the kids that they parent. And so what happens in those family situations where you have a youngster who really wants to get that full ride athletic scholarship or has dreams of playing professional sports? How do you intervene with a family where mom and dad, again, already have it in their mind that this is what's going to happen, and they just have no idea of the realities, the data. In fact, I'll introduce it now so you have a better idea of just how few kids do go on to compete in college and professional sports. And most counselors are unaware of this, most parents are unaware of this, but the numbers that we see look like this. Roughly about 5 to 7% of all high school student athletes will ever go on to compete at the college level. Now notice I'm saying compete. That is not all full ride athletic scholarship athletes. In fact, that number, even the high water number of 7%, includes full ride scholarship, but it also includes partial athletic scholarships, walk-ons, which means athletes that go on and compete with no scholarship money, and it also includes Division III student athletes, your smaller school athletes that get no money whatsoever for athletic scholarship money. So you see that that number is a little bit misleading. But even if we were to assume that all 7% were full athletic scholarship athletes, that's still a 93% attrition rate, meaning that 93% of the high school student athletes out there today will not go on to compete at the college level. Now, to tease this model out a little bit more than that, if you take a look at all of the college student athletes in the country today, you're looking at about a 1.5% to 2% number of college student athletes that go on to play professional sports. So think about that. You already had a very small number of student athletes who go on to play college sports to begin with. But then when you take all those college student athletes and you narrow it down to where 98.5% of those athletes see their careers end, you can see pretty quickly that it is quite a long shot to go on and become a professional athlete. Again, I'm bringing this up because a lot of times it is these misunderstandings, or maybe this ignorance, you might argue, to where a lot of these problems begin and are perpetuated. And for example, if you've got mom and dad who truly believe that 50% of the kids playing sports will go on to get full ride athletic scholarships, right there you can see there's a problem. So if you're a counselor, whether you're working in a school system or a private practice, you always want to pay attention to what knowledge base the family's working from. Now, I don't expect that they're going to know the data that I just presented to you here, but their understanding of this data should be closer to what I presented than what I mentioned a moment ago about 50% of the kids going on to get full ride scholarships. So that's really important. And again, we'll come back to that later in the program. Another big issue that's unique to student athletes today, and why we're studying them and why we're offering this training to you as a counselor, has to do with drugs. And there's different categories of drugs that student athletes will have to deal with. And one of the ones that comes to mind right away is performance drugs. We have a long storied history of anabolic steroids and other mimic type drugs that are often outlawed or banned by professional college and interscholastic leagues, but yet kids are always pushing the envelope. Sometimes it's to meet their own dreams, sometimes they feel the pressure from others. It could be teammates, coaches who introduce something and say, hey, you can try this for a short while, there won't be any problems, it'll really help your play on the field. Sometimes it can even be covert pressure. You could be talking to a student athlete who's recognized as one of the better players in his school. Maybe the community is really banking on him to have a great season. There's a lot of pressure, and so he feels it, even though no one has directed him to do it, nobody has verbally expressed it directly, he feels that pressure. And I always tell people, be aware that communities often, you can take the temperature of a community often by their sports programs, whether you like it or not. Especially if you're watching this program today from a small community, you can probably remember the last time one of your local school teams won a state championship or got deep into the state playoffs. It's kind of funny and kind of ironic. Even the ownership of a team by the community, the pronouns kind of change. If the team is winning and doing well, you'll often hear people in the community saying, we're winning, we're number one. But when they're not doing so well, they kind of depersonalize and say, well, they're having a bad season. They're not doing so well this year. And so, we really do know sports plays a big part, not only in the school systems, but the communities at large. But there are drugs to be reckoned with. In addition to performance drugs, you still have traditional recreation drugs. In recent years now, we've seen some of the states across the country legalize marijuana, so that has created even a new wrinkle with respect to, if a drug is legal and a person is of age, can they use it? Sports leagues still ban it. The medical community is still mixed on whether or not they see the same level of efficacy when the drugs are being used, when marijuana is being used, for example, to manage chronic pain would be an example. And then we have our prescription pain pills. That has been a big issue in recent years. The NFL is now working with former players that might end up being a lawsuit. Some players saying that the drugs were widely dispersed and used without a lot of medical oversight. But it doesn't even have to be a professional athlete issue. We have seen across the country an epidemic with respect to opiates and various prescription pain pill medications, and even heroin, which mimics the prescription pain pills. And so a lot of student athletes have turned to these to manage an injury, and then only to find out later that they had become physiologically addicted to the drug. And so in my practice, I have certainly treated that over the years, and I know in working with many schools and school counselors, they've also seen it there as well. So that's another issue. And then finally, when we're talking about drugs today, we even have the concern of prescription medications. Drugs that are being used for ADHD, or some of the antidepressants that are out there. Some of these drugs come with a lot of side effects, what we call the black box warnings. And so you want to be careful there that the student athlete may be seeing issues relating to the drug that he or she's put on for ADHD or depression. And then when you put all this together, you've got teenage kids that are growing, going through puberty, their bodies are changing. They may in fact be using a performance drug, they may be on a prescription medication, and they may even be using a drug like marijuana recreationally. So you can see there's a lot going on in just that example right there, where a counselor could be called in, maybe in conjunction with some drug specialists or a pediatrician or some other physician. And you might be asked to kind of play a role in helping sort it all out, trying to determine what drugs or substances are healthy, safe, needed versus those that are not, or those drugs that are being abused. So again, we'll come back to that, but again, for this segment, I wanted to illustrate some of these things that really have led to us needing more training for counselors to work with student athletes. And then one other issue I'll just introduce now, and we'll come back to this later as well, is the lacking support that student athletes have at the ends of their career. And I talk about the sport retirement transition. This is an area I've done a lot of work in myself. Almost 20 years ago, it was my doctoral dissertation looking at elite level athletes and some of the psychosocial issues that they faced during their sport retirement transition. And it's interesting, back in the 1990s, the only real at-risk athletes used to be professional athletes and athletes at the college level who came from your revenue sharing sports, your football and men's basketball programs. And in those instances, we would see student athletes and even professional athletes face some real trauma, not understanding who they were, they had played their whole lives as an athlete, and not having much of a support system to use to transition out of sports. And we know that social support is actually a mediating variable through this transition and really leads to a more successful transition. And what I mean by that is simply having people in your life that can help you, that can talk to you, that can offer some guidance. That really makes a difference when we're looking at successfully transitioning through sport retirement. Now, again, how does this come into what we're talking about here today when working with student athletes? Well, since the 1990s, and I have seen this at my practice, I have talked to other colleagues about this, I've talked to college coaches, high school coaches, I work with these student athletes, and there's no doubt in my mind that we have seen this trickle down. It's no longer just a risk for professional and college athletes, but we now have small college athletes that face these same transition difficulties. We have high school student athletes that run into these same transition stressors. Now, I'm not saying that every kid who plays sports is going to have a terrible time when their career ends, but when you see more and more kids today starting sports at an early age, sometimes 4 or 5 years old, getting into very serious leagues, getting into travel leagues very early, specializing in a sport, sometimes playing that sport year-round, what happens is over time they create a very strong identity, an athletic identity, and I'll talk about that in a later segment as well. But as that identity becomes stronger and stronger, you start to see increasingly more student athletes having trouble letting go. They often don't plan for their sport retirement. Sometimes they enter this transition not because of choice. It could be a career-ending injury. And what happens is typically when an athlete's career ends, whether it's a pro athlete or even someone at the high school or junior high school level, they lose that identity very quickly, and they also lose a lot of the support around them. Society generally doesn't find them as valuable or as interesting. Of course, that's not something we like to talk about, but it is true for a lot of kids. They're not hanging on to that athlete moniker anymore, and so in some instances, they don't have that same recognition that they used to have. And whether you think that's important or not, it really doesn't matter what we think, but what I can tell you from the athlete perspective, even teenage kids sometimes really struggle with that, not having anybody to turn to, no longer having teammates to talk to, or maybe a coach to go to, and so they don't really know where to go to get that counseling assistance. They don't have that social support, and a lot of times they're just frustrated, and they wanted their career to go on, and it didn't. And again, depending on their level of coping and if they know how to cope in healthy, safe, successful ways, that really makes a big difference to whether or not they transition out in a positive way or if they end up having trouble. And depending on your age watching this program today, you may even know, of people your age or older today that are adults that still talk about, when they used to be an athlete in high school or college. Maybe they still have unfinished business, and again, that might sound kind of strange, but it is in fact a truth where if you haven't successfully transitioned out, that can be something that you carry with you for many years to come. So those are again just a few of the issues to kind of validate why we really truly need to understand today's student athlete, what the issues are that they experience, how we can maybe see some of those red flags. And I want to kind of end this first segment by talking about how important it is for counselors working in this field to understand just the athlete prototype today, because student athletes are not generally the first ones to seek counseling. Athletes by and large tend to have more of what I call that machismo mindset, where they've learned that in order to find success on the field, on the court, or whatever sport they do, it often requires them to be the first ones to practice, the last ones to leave, to do those extra voluntary practices, to go out and do runs on their own. And I think what they've learned through these experiences is that in order to be the best and to be successful, you have to do these things on your own, and that sometimes letting your guard down and talking to someone can be perceived as a sign of weakness, even though I don't believe that, and I'm sure you don't believe that. I think for a lot of student athletes that is in fact the case. And so why this is important to you as a counselor, you need to understand their lifestyle, some of the pressures that they face, the pressures that they put on themselves, the pressures that school systems sometimes expect if we are expecting the team to be really good this year, and sometimes even the community at large. These kids are in the media a lot, they're being blogged about, they're in forums, they're talked about in local newspapers, you sometimes see them in the news. That can be a lot of pressure for a 14, 15, 16-year-old young person. And so you need to understand that, but you also need to know a little bit about their sport. And sometimes a counselor can miss right from the beginning of what would have maybe been a positive therapeutic relationship. And what I mean by that is, let's take for example the sport of baseball. We talk about baseball games. In tennis we might talk about tennis matches. But if you're a counselor and you know nothing about baseball and you have a baseball player come into your office and maybe want to talk about what he's experiencing, maybe he's got performance anxiety, maybe he's facing the end of his career, maybe he's dealing with struggles relating to the mental aspects of an injury, and you come out and ask like, well, how are you doing in the baseball matches? You will probably lose what would have been a positive therapeutic relationship right there. And I know that might sound funny, but to the athlete, what that's saying to him or her is that you really don't know what they're experiencing. And so it behooves you as a counselor in training, as somebody who's a helping professional, to understand the sport as well as you can. Now, I'm not saying that you need to know all the inside outs of a sport. I used baseball as an example a moment ago. You don't need to learn how to calculate an earned run average or something like that. But you should have a general understanding of the sport. What the lifestyle is like. How many games do they play over the course of a summer, for example? I think knowing some of that is vitally important to connecting, building that rapport with student athletes. And when you're able to do that, when you're able to build that trust very early on, it just makes the counseling relationship that much easier. And obviously the goal here is ultimately to provide the therapy needed to a student athlete so that he or she can get through any of the issues that they might face, be it a sport-related issue or even just a general issue that has nothing to do with sports. I've been talking about student athletes here and talking about all the uniqueness of being an athlete, but let's keep in mind that they also face the same issues that their peers not involved in athletics face. Academic challenges, social relationships, pressure to use drugs, alcohol, all of the same issues that any teenager would face. Student athletes are not unique and steered away from those issues any differently. So that's a little bit about why we study student athletes. I hope that this sets the table for the next few segments where we'll kind of delve into the identity a little bit more and help you really carve out a niche within your practice so that you can offer the help that student athletes need today so that they can have a happy, healthy, and safe experience in sports today.